very happy to have everyone to join us for the Q&A session for the talk by Nick Bowman. My name is Tammy Ling Rizhen. I'm a professor in the Department of Advertising and College of Communication at National Chengchi University. I'm also a member in TIGCR, which is Taiwan Institute for Governance and Communication Research. So today we just had a wonderful talk about the open science, a few weeks ago by Nick Bowman. And Nick Bowman is an associate professor in the College of Media and Communication at the Texas Tech University. And we're happy to have Nick back today. And he got up really early just for us to have the questions. And I have 6 questions with me in my hand, so I'm going to just read one, and we can listen to what Nick thinks. And then at the end, if we have time, because we have to end the session before 6 o'clock, but if we have time, we are very happy and open the time for the live audience, and you're welcome to ask any questions to Nick. Okay, so the first question is from someone who's anonymous from the College of Communication at National Chengchi University. She or he said, "Thanks for sharing. What I'm concerned is that after other researchers obtain my research data, which hasn't been launched, they rewrite part of my data and publish similar research that individual said before she or he launched the published data. So this cannot be defined as plagiarism. But how can we avoid the situation in open science like this?"
Sure, and thank you for the questions, and thank you for letting me come in so early and wearing my hat. I was telling Tammy, due to COVID-19, I still haven't visited a barber shop yet, so it was the easiest way to present myself for the morning's talk. So the question is, the question that comes up is a very common one, and essentially has to do with other folks using my materials, right? And there's a couple ways to look at this question. One of them is that when you're working, it has to do often with whether or not you've published your manuscript or not. So when you're using open science practices, one of the things that usually happens when you're submitting a manuscript to a journal and you're going through the normal peer review process is that that stage in your research, there's not necessarily a requirement that you have to make your materials public yet. Just as if you were submitting a manuscript to a journal, that manuscript would be considered private during the review session. It's confidential. The reviewers can't share it. The same standards would apply to your data and to your materials and other parts of your project. So if you submitted an entire package to a journal, your manuscript, your data, your materials, and those things, they would be considered confidential. And in fact, when you're creating your open science spaces, many of them have a special setting just for the peer review process where you can actually set your materials to be private and anonymous. In other words, there shouldn't be an opportunity for somebody to steal something because the situation should all be contained. Now, another thing people do has to do with when a paper is published. And so let's say you're working on a long-term or a larger data set and your very first paper is being published. In that situation, what you can do is what's called a data embargo. So many people have debated the idea of releasing your manuscripts with a statement that the data and the materials for this project may not be shared for a couple of months or something longer. This is debatable. Some folks feel that it may contrast with the idea of transparency. Other folks feel that we have to be honest and balance out career incentives. We do know, whether it's appropriate or not, that many people do need exclusivity for their work to be rewarded for that and to get their publications out. So during the submission process, everything should still be private. There's nothing that says you have to share everything publicly the moment you do a study, right? Even in my own research, I don't load up all of my materials until I'm ready to actually publish the paper or have it reviewed. For papers that are published, you can consider data embargoes where you can withhold certain parts of the data. This happens a lot in large grants where you might say, I'm still doing the research, so I'm not releasing all of it, but I do have a data statement saying that the information will be released.
Yeah, but usually how long is the embargo? 2 years, or it really depends on the researcher?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, there's no I don't think industry standard, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of debates around it in general. Um, I don't have much of an answer. I think it somewhat depends on the long-term prospects of your work, right? Because
Yeah.
if you can't release the data for years, then it's almost like what's the point of even saying release it, right?
Yeah.
What
Right.
some, what some people will do is they might release just the part of their data for that
Yeah.
one manuscript, and then they'll state that this is part of a larger project. And
Yeah.
then as they publish papers, they'll release more data, and then they'll link those projects together. So somebody who's reading paper number 4 can see number 3 and number 2 and number 1. There isn't a great standard for the embargo system. It's not something that's, I think, been seriously engaged in communication. Um, yeah, I don't have a great gut answer. It kind of depends on your long term. Now, I
Yeah.
will say that in all of this, you're publishing your data, you're sharing your materials. One thing that should definitely be happening is that those are all citable documents. So
Mhm.
if Tammy Lynn does a study and she publishes a data set as part of that data set can be assigned a DOI, a digital object identifier. And if anybody else were to use that data set, scientific norms and practices would suggest that they would cite the original
Yeah, the
material.
researcher. Yes.
Exactly. So a lot of this does require us to resolve our norms and to kind of trust each other in a sense, right? But there shouldn't be any more fear of these things being taken as there are any other review material being taken. So the amount of confidence we have, for example, in the confidentiality of peer review would extend over to any materials that you share as part of that peer review.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And the second question is from Song Ang Cai from the Department of Diplomacy at NCCU, which is National Chengchi University. So the question is, many publications are profit-oriented businesses, like journal articles and books needed to be paid for downloading. If works are involved in the third profitable units, such as publishers, how can we reduce damage to cooperative units in open science?
This is a fair question, right? And admittedly, as publishers, as researchers, we don't always think about the impact of our actions on the publishing houses. For example, in the United States, there's a lot of debate around how much money publishers make. And so, in fact, sometimes we can even be a bit aggressive towards the publishers who are putting in the capital to make the journals possible. And we can certainly debate the economics of academia. When I was an editor for communication research reports, we had this debate with our journal. And some of the initial conversations, for example, were that they were nervous about us publishing materials that weren't behind paywalls, right? So if a manuscript's behind a paywall, the publisher was kind of expecting that so would the other materials, and that they might actually host the materials. That conversation changed pretty quickly. And in my current experiences, I've edited 2 journals and I've worked as a guest editor with 3 other journals. It hasn't been much of a concern, in part because the manuscripts themselves, which are really what most publishers concern themselves with, they're still being published in journals. They're not being taken away. Oftentimes, when researchers are including their open materials, their data, their study, their stimulus, those things are going into third-party databases that are linked to the manuscript, but they're sort of separate entities, right? My data set and my experimental videos might be with the Open Science Framework webpage, but my manuscript is still with Taylor and Francis or Rutledge or Wiley or whoever it is I'm publishing with, right? Another thing that publishers seem to have been open to is the notion that we are seeing data suggesting that manuscripts that are sharing their materials do seem to be enjoying citation increases. So to the extent that publishers are concerned about, the utility of the research, there is some emerging suggesting that when manuscripts share the materials, people might have more confidence in those manuscripts. Now, that's just based on correlations. So we don't have like a deep, thick analysis of people's opinions and attitudes towards these things. But one argument might be that the manuscripts that have published materials and published data are easier to verify. Another one could be, frankly, they're more useful for a researcher. I talk to my students a lot about how frustrating it is when you can't find a scale or you can't find a stimulus material. And if you've got a
Mm,
manuscript that has all those things in it, you might be more inclined to cite that work. Now, we hope, of course, you're citing it because it's also good. Um, but there doesn't seem to be much of a concern about publications with citations because the shared materials are getting cited. Um, the one area of this that I think is hotly debated is the notion of preprints. And this is when scientific teams publish their own manuscripts outside of the journal entirely,
yeah.
including papers that are accepted. That one's going to be a hot issue because, of course, on the one hand, you are allowed to publish your non-formatted content and posting it to a website.
Yes.
That is an area that I'm curious to see how it grows. But I'll say, even there, if you look at some of the leading journals, they've been open to the practice. And I think some of that is, at the end of the day, even if you're sharing your preprints and sharing your data and sharing your materials, you're still signing your copyright agreements with the publishers. So I've been surprised at how open many publishers have been. And that's changed in only 5 years. So, like 5 years ago, my first conversation with a publisher, they were not cool with this idea. And they actually wanted to host all the materials themselves. Fast forward to 2020, the same publisher doesn't seem to be. In fact, the same publisher is now using open science badges for the manuscript. So the fear seems to have gone away.
Cool. We're happy to see how that grows in the future. Probably all the publishers will be open to all the things because it's easier for them to get the citation so that their impact factor can boost. And so the third question is from Beihan Rek. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, who is a graduate student from NCCU who's also online currently with us. And his question is, thank you for the insightful speech. It usually requires more than two people for teamwork. So the research results are for every team member. If the co-author doesn't agree with open data, would that be possible that parts of the results are open for public?
This is an incredibly important discussion to have. And any of us who have been practicing science for a long time have had a conflict with the research team. And I'm often surprised how often that we do not negotiate things like authorship or ownership early on in a project. It's kind of an uncomfortable conversation to have at times. We get excited, and most of us are doing this because we love the knowledge, and the rewards of that love are not as important when you're doing the project. But then come publication time, they're important, right? So the first and foremost answer is that should be something that's negotiated right away. Um, that's important because a lot of folks, especially folks who support open science practices, I think they sometimes tend to assume that so does everybody else. And it's a relatively new concept in communication sciences, and not everybody really understands what open science practices mean. So, Tammy and I might have very different ideas on what we're going to share in a project. And if we don't negotiate that up front, it's going to really hurt us in the end. And furthermore, especially coming from a graduate student, we are seeing trends that researchers who are still learning their scientific practice might be a little more open to open science practices just because they don't have any norms in place. Whereas somebody who's been researching for quite a while has a system that's worked for them and may not necessarily be as open to some of these concepts. So first and foremost, you have to negotiate this up front. And you have to be on the same page. And what layer of sharing are you going to engage in? Are you going to share data? Are you going to share materials? Are you going to share qualitative data? You don't want to make those decisions later on. You have to make them at the beginning of a project. The other part of that, when your teams disagree, is remembering that open doesn't mean everything. An article with Justin Keene, we talked about layers of transparency. Not every aspect of every study can always be shared. If Tammy and I were talking before the call, if you're doing research on vulnerable populations and you're telling their stories and you're using transcripts, and it's a population, of Hakka in a particular village that you can't make anonymous, then you're not going to want to share that data later. And you want to know going into that project what our parameters are around data privacy. But what you might share, for example, are your transcript questions or your sampling guide or something like this, right? So there are layers to make a study transparent that might make a research team still feel comfortable. Um, it's always a possibility to offer some things rather than all things. At the end of the day, if your teams disagree, you know, that's partly an internal question. I don't think I would ever feel comfortable taking somebody else's data and sharing it out of principle. To me, that's a violation of the internal trust in my team. What I would do is go into a project up front, explain my motivations, because also remember the participants need to be aware of this, right? So if you're designing a study and you're not deciding up front that you're going to share your data, there's no way you're going to be able to inform your participants of that decision. And then if you decide a year later that you want to go ahead and share everything, that could be, ethically problematic. So I don't have a great answer, only because it's a great question. And it's very much an internal question. But part of it is negotiating up front. Part of it is understanding what we mean by sharing and what the team is comfortable with sharing and listening to the reasons why you wouldn't or would not share. And then finally, at the end of the day, I think whatever you've negotiated, you have to stick to. You can't decide later that you're going to share something that 6 months ago you weren't going to share. That's important because it somewhat defeats the purpose of transparency. I have seen some teams that they seem to maybe only want to share the data that's cool, and then the stuff that's not as cool they don't want to share. But that defeats the purpose of transparency, right? You got to share everything if that's what you're going to do. So, negotiating up front, not just for your own team, but also for the welfare and the rights of your participants as well.
Yeah, so the selective sharing might be problematic and also probably will be open washing. So, okay, so that's a very good, very great answer. And our Beihan just said totally agree. He tested that. Cool. Okay, so okay, I'm going to talk about the fourth question from someone who's anonymous from College of Social Science in National Chengchi University. So the question is, this speech offers many detailed and clear practical procedures for open science. As a qualitative researcher, our research data may include transcripts, recording files, and videos which can identify the information of interviewees. The procedure of qualitative research may also be difficult to replicate. How should we implement open science in this case?
So the notion of transparency in qualitative data is a really fiercely debated topic. This has come up in several different circles. In fact, in our manuscript of the Journal of Communication, it's the lead author is Thomas Steenland, and there's a lot of other authors on that paper. We talk a bit about some very specific things, and I provided some more detailed answers with Tammy and the team that I'm sure they're going to share with everybody as well. Um, One of the issues when we're talking about qualitative work is that replication is often not as important, right? If you're going into a study to understand nuance and to uncover, previously, overlooked or unforeseen data that's contextualized at the one particular interpretive lens, replication isn't always as critical. And that's important because a lot of the open science movement was based around replication. And it was researchers, often quantitative researchers, were running analyses, running data, publishing the data, and it wasn't really clear if those results from the one study would replicate in other scenarios, in part because maybe they did some selective analyses, or perhaps they changed their predictions once the results came out, or the effect sizes were very small, right? That doesn't really come up in the qualitative side of the field because you're often not trying to generalize your findings necessarily to a broader population. And so Lee Humphreys at the ICA conference earlier this year reminded us that for qualitative work and really for all research, maybe transparency is more relevant. The idea of all open science practices being to help us, be able to verify a study rather than just trusting the authors. So related to that, sharing qualitative data brings with it an important consideration of privacy, of these interview privacy. Um, and this is where I also remind people again that there's a misnomer that when we talk about open science practices, that it's an all or nothing proposition. And that's just not true. There are data sets I share even on the quantitative side where I don't share demographic information. It's not relevant to my analysis. It's only relevant for my descriptive statistics, and it's potentially damaging, right? Because if you have enough pieces of data about somebody, you may be able to figure out who they are. Oftentimes in transcripts, what I'll share is not the raw transcripts, but I might share my coding files or my notes. And so I do an emergent thematic analysis of interviews with gamers about their experiences with demand and how, cognitively and emotionally demanding the equipment is. And I may not share the raw data from that project, but instead I might share my coding notes and my annotations and the elements of my research that helped me arrive at the conclusions that I made in the paper itself. I will say that there's also no inherent prohibition against sharing qualitative data. Um, if you've gotten consent from your participants, if you've been able to read the data to see if there are identifying remarks, if it's data that was gathered directly, so you didn't scrape it from the internet where somebody could just take that data, type it into Google search, and then find, the forum, but you got it, in a laboratory setting, that might be different because those data, if they don't have any demographic information and they don't have any psychographic information, and you didn't talk about anything sensitive, it may not be a big deal to share 150, transcript interviews about how fun this video game was. So it's always a cost benefit ratio.
Yeah.
I would always encourage folks to work with their IRBs, with their ethics boards. Several times I've taken the data I want to share, called the ethics board, and just asked them, would you see a problem with this data set being shared? And oftentimes they'll analyze it for you because they don't necessarily know the details of a project. And so if they don't see a problem with it and it's out of context and you can't find a problem in context, it might be okay. So my shorter answer to that is that you should never feel pressured to share qualitative data simply because you want to chase down transparency for its own sake. You shouldn't feel as if you cannot share qualitative data because just because the data is textual doesn't mean it's vulnerable, doesn't mean it's going to put somebody at danger. With all data, the most important thing is removing identifying information. And that might just look very differently in a qualitative data set. And then related to that, the efforts here for transparency might mean that, again, maybe you're not able to share the granular details of your transcripts, but you are able to share your annotations and your notes. In my experience as an editor, the most common things I've seen shared by qualitative scholars are those notes. And that seems to be kind of fun because when you're reading the manuscript, especially in a qualitative paper where you may not have a lot of room to explain in detail your coding methods, it gives you a way to fight back against the allegations that the methodology was quote unquote squishy or soft, that you didn't have a structure, because then I can take a note and I can actually see your structure. And here's how you did theoretical saturation. Here's how you did all these other elements. So that's been successful, at least in the short term.
So always share your data as a supplement for your manuscript to improve the open science. Great. The fifth question is from Sherry from Lynn Economics Department. And the question is that about the timeliness of research results, it may take time to arrange open material and data so that they can be available for the public. What if the original research results are damaged when we arrange the information? How can we avoid this problem? Thank you so much.
Yes. So this one is a rough one, right? You're in the process of taking your materials and kicking them out. What do you do to make sure you don't damage the materials? So one thing we talk about is the idea of tidy data, is making sure that within your research team that things are cleaned constantly. One of my colleagues, Jacob Fischer, had a great line about this. And he said, the worst co-author in your career is you 6 months ago. Because we all think we're organized at the time. and then we make idiosyncratic decisions that are only for us, right? To manage data, to manage resources. And then we go back and find our data set and we didn't label something or we gave it a funny or a cute name. And suddenly we're trying to track down files and they're not written in a way that everybody else could understand. And so tidy data refers to scenarios where you always make sure that your data, your numbers have some kind of interpretable value so that if for some reason you didn't have access to them and somebody else could read them, they could totally replicate whatever it is that's in your original data set. So part of that is a larger lesson on keeping things organized throughout a project with the mindset that they're going to be shared. So what I've done in my career now is I don't even start data analysis until I have a file that it would be as ready to be shared with the world as it is to be shared on my computer. Obviously, if data becomes damaged, there's not a whole lot you can do. And I wish I had a better answer. But if something gets damaged and you can't share it, you can't share it. And that may or may not invite skepticism. But you can't share what you don't have. So there's always storing backups. Now, one thing I will say is that if you're using these open science repositories, you have a nice redundant backup system. So I'm doing a project right now where I've already put my data online and I haven't even analyzed it yet. Now it's still in a private folder, only myself and my co-author can get to it. But that helps us keep track of where our data is at. And I also explain in a longer answer a naming system for cleaning data and analyzing data to make sure you've got several redundant copies of your work. Because sometimes you might just label something wrong as you're preparing it for the public. But if you can go back one version of your data set and go, oh, okay, this was the pre-analysis data set. Here's the analysis data set. I found my error. In fact, I just published a paper last night where one of the things I had to do was release a new data set to the public because I noticed that one variable was miscoded. But if you look at my data history, you can see both files and they're time-stamped and they're labeled. You can clearly tell here's data set A, here's data set A.1. So one way to do it is versioning and thinking about transparency from the very beginning of a project.
Wow, great answer. Well, here comes the sixth question. It's from Shenting Chen, an associate professor from School of Journalism and Communication from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So she said, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I write to ask how open science will affect the peer review process. I recently experienced a manuscript review that the authors asked me to go to the online open science site to check their data information and the pre-registered information. I can see all the useful information on the site. However, in this way, reviewers will be able to tell who the authors are, and the process will not be double-blind review because it's a really small world, So I'm wondering if there are ways to avoid this issue. Thank you.
There are, and this comes with we're still learning how to use it. The shortest answer is that you can make it anonymous, and a lot of users don't know this. In the open science framework in particular, osf.io, when you make, as a researcher, when you make a space, you can go into your own space and under the contributors option, there's a option you have to choose to make your information private and what's called read-only and anonymous. And it will generate a unique link that when someone clicks on that link, they can see all the materials, but they can't see who owns the space. So a lot of folks don't know about this because admittedly, we haven't had a lot of training and experience with these programs. And the programs are meant to facilitate transparency, so they're not necessarily built to hide things, right? The other issue with that is even if you generate an anonymous link, a big mistake that a lot of researchers make is they upload all their materials and it has their name all over it. So you upload your survey and it has your name in the consent form, or you upload your materials and it has your university logo. So going back to the last question, you have to do a little bit of scrubbing. So when you're getting things ready to share with the public, you've got to go in and take a little bit of time to remove your name, remove logos, set those links to private. I suspect in that one experience, the authors working in that space didn't know this. I'll tell you as an editor, this happens probably once a week. where I had to catch one in advance and go, hey, before
Very
you send
often.
that out, yeah, I need your anonymous link, not your OSF link. And that goes back to the first question about data stealing, right? Is that I think some people have been taught you've got to share everything and it's got to be public and it's got to happen right now and you have no privacy. And that's not really the intention here. Eventually it is. The long-term goal of all of this is that it would be public. A line that I use a lot is we want you to publish more, but we don't mean more manuscripts. We mean more stuff, more materials, more notes, more data. We want to understand research in a more nuanced way. And I suspect for this question is you had an authorship team that was a bit overeager, and then they just shared everything unknowingly. So definitely check those links. If it sounds silly, send it to somebody else. So I often message Tammy like at 3 o'clock in the morning. Hey, Tammy, can you click on this link and see if you can see my name? And then if she can't, then I know that it's anonymous. But, many systems have that built in and do not use a system that doesn't allow you some degree of privacy if you're engaging in peer review and blind review.
Cool. We have roughly 4 minutes left, but Dr. Ji Huang, who is the PI of TIGCR, just had the last question. So he asked, I assembled an archive consists of 5 newspaper reports of major political events in the past 10 years. Can I share this archive on website?
That's a good question because it often depends on the country you're in, right? So in the United States, yeah, it's usually not an issue. Fair use would be at play here. You're not profiting from the collection. It's part of an educational collection. It's usually not an issue. There's a very famous archive of the image of the journalist in entertainment media. It's forgetting the professor's name right now, Joe Saltzman, and he's published several thousand examples of how journalists are portrayed in media and entertainment. My understanding in Taiwan is that if you're sharing more than the headline, that you may have to pay a small fee to the media company. And I don't know the laws particularly well there. I will say that at the broad level, whenever I am working with readily available data, content analysis of tweets, for example, I've usually had no issue sharing those things because in a way, they're already public. All you're doing is arranging them in a particular data set. So I just did a project of US members of Congress and their tweets during a mass shooting, right? Those are part of the public record. So I just took those tweets, reorganized them for a data set, and then I shared them publicly. My gut would say that newspaper reports of political events in the past 10 years are being archived by an institution as an educational tool. Going off of US regulations, that would seem to be fair use. It would seem to be third-party analysis. You wouldn't need IRB for that. You wouldn't need consent for that. The data already exists. I don't know the uniqueness of the legislation in Taiwan, but my gut would say that's the kind of stuff that when I've edited papers in the past, those are the most common things shared. Someone does a content analysis of TV shows and they share the titles of the shows, or newspapers and magazines, they share the actual materials. Now, what you normally can't do is upload your own versions, like going to the website of the newspaper, printing off a PDF behind a paywall, and then taking that PDF and then sharing it as yours. But you usually can link to the original sources, right? Because they don't lose value in that scenario. I couldn't go to Netflix, download a movie from my account, and then re-upload it to my OSF as material for my study. But I could link in a database to all the videos I used in my study. So I suspect it would depend on the copyright regulations and the paywall. But that's where I would be just looking from this side of the ocean.
Okay. Oh, we just got all the answers in time, and we're very happy. And thank you so much for all the time with us. And thank you, Nick, for the answering. So if you have any more questions, you're welcome to come to the YouTube link or email Nick at nick.bowman@ttu.edu. So we'll see you next time, and have a good evening or have a good day. And Nick, you can go back to sleep again. We'll say bye to everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much.